In this video, we'll continue talking about developmental changes that occur across the life course. Specifically, I'll be discussing some important physical, cognitive, and social changes that occur during adolescence and early adulthood. Adolescence is a developmental stage that begins with the onset of puberty and ends with the transition to adulthood. Today, this encompasses roughly the ages between about 10 and 11 and 18 to 20. The duration of adolescence has changed throughout history, with adolescence today lasting longer than it did in the past. This expanded duration is caused by both an earlier onset of puberty as well as a later transition to adulthood. Currently, puberty today begins, on average, around ages 10 to 11 in girls and around ages 11 to 12 in boys. However, there's converging evidence that this is much younger than even just 200 or so years ago, as you can see in this graph. No one knows exactly what is causing this trend, but it is an area of ongoing research. Additionally, the transition to adulthood is occurring later today than in previous time points. The transition into adulthood is typically marked by major changes, such as moving out on one's own, beginning a career and becoming financially independent, and perhaps starting one's own family. In America and other industrialized nations in Europe and Asia, these transitions are happening later in life than they used to in previous generations. Because of this, some researchers have proposed that we need to create a new developmental stage called emerging adulthood that lasts from around ages 18 to 25. During this time, young adults are afforded some degree of independence. For example, they might move out of their parents' house for the first time. They may also be responsible for certain aspects of their lives, such as being in charge of their own schedule or managing a small amount of income from working a part-time job. However, they may still be reliant on parents or institutions for other basic life needs. For example, many colleges provide dining halls and meal plans, delaying the need to cook for oneself. Teachers provide more help with assignments than bosses typically do, and many young adults may still be financially dependent on parents or other relatives. Thus, emerging adulthood can be thought of as a kind of in-between stage, where young people are getting their first taste of adulthood without yet being fully independent. As I mentioned earlier, adolescence begins with the onset of puberty, which is the developmental process whereby people become capable of reproduction. This process is triggered by the release of hormones, which are controlled by the pituitary gland and hypothalamus. As a result, adolescents undergo some important physical changes, such as the development of primary and secondary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics are the physical changes that are directly involved in reproduction. This includes the maturation of sexual organs, such as ovaries in women. Secondary sex characteristics, in contrast, are any physical change that is not directly involved in reproduction, such as the capacity in men to grow facial hair. In addition to these outward physical changes, important cognitive changes are also happening during adolescent development. In the last module, we discussed Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which ended with the formal operational stage around 12 years old, or around the start of adolescence. By this point, the majority of individuals have mastered most basic cognitive tasks. They understand that objects continue to exist, even when they can't see them. They can infer others' mental states and motivations, and they can think abstractly and hypothetically to solve complex problems. However, that doesn't mean that adolescents' brains are finished developing. You may have heard before that people's brains don't finish fully developing until around age 25. This appears to be a bit of a pop cultural myth. Research doesn't support anything magical about the age 25 in particular. However, it is true that our brains continue developing into our 20s. Specifically, the frontal lobe, and in particular the prefrontal cortex, are some of the last parts of the brain to fully mature. If you remember from Module 3.1, the frontal lobe is responsible for higher-level cognitive functions, such as decision-making and rational thought. It's also critical for engaging in delayed gratification, that is, making choices that trade off short-term pain for long-term gain, such as the decision to wake up early so that you can go work out, choosing a salad instead of a burger, or avoiding partying on a Friday night so that you can stay in and study for a big exam on Monday. The fact that teenagers' frontal lobes are still developing may be one reason why teenagers often struggle with these kinds of delayed gratification tasks, often failing to fully consider the long-term consequences of potentially risky behavior, such as smoking or texting while driving. During adolescence, other important changes are also happening at the neuronal level. Just before puberty, children undergo a wave of synaptogenesis. Remember from Module 7.2 that synaptogenesis refers to the formation of new synapses or neural connections in the brain. In fact, by puberty, the density of dendritic spines in the prefrontal cortex is 2 to 3 times greater compared to that of adults. However, these new synapses don't last forever. Instead, irrelevant synapses are gradually removed over time in a process called pruning. This follows a use it or lose it principle. Synapses that are more active are strengthened, and synapses that are less active are weakened and ultimately pruned. Lastly, adolescence and young adulthood is also a time of important social development. As we discussed in the previous video, early childhood is a critical period when children are learning to form attachments to their primary caregivers, and these attachments can impact their adult relationships too. However, during adolescence, parents' influence on their children's outcomes decreases, and peer groups become increasingly important. In fact, there's some evidence that peer influence is an even bigger predictor of teenagers' behavior than parental influence is. These peer groups have the power to influence people's behavior for either better or worse. On the one hand, teenagers may fall victim to the dreaded power of so-called peer pressure. If they have friends who smoke or engage in other kinds of unhealthy or risky behaviors, they may in turn be more likely to engage in those same kinds of behaviors themselves. However, friend groups can also be a very positive influence on teenagers' lives, and forming healthy and meaningful friendships can positively impact teens' outcomes. In this video, we covered adolescents' physical, cognitive, and social development. For the exam, you should be able to define the period of adolescence and describe how it has changed over time, define emerging adulthood, define puberty, and describe the physical changes that occur during this time, that is, the development of primary and secondary sex characteristics, describe the major cognitive changes that occur during adolescence, including brain development, synaptogenesis, and pruning, and describe how peers can influence adolescents' social development.